The dust swirled around Marshal Jake Harrison's boots as he rode into Deadwood Creek on a scorching August morning in 1887. The town lay before him like a festering wound on the prairie, its wooden buildings weathered and crooked, casting long shadows that seemed to hide secrets in every corner. Harrison had been tracking the notorious outlaw Blackjack Morrison for 3 months across 2 territories, following a trail of bank robberies and murdered witnesses that led straight to this god-forsaken place. Harrison was a man carved from granite and determination. At 35, he had already earned a reputation as the lawman who never backed down, never compromised, and never left a job unfinished. His weathered face bore the scars of countless confrontations, and his steel-gray eyes missed nothing. What made him different from other lawmen was his complete refusal to work with corrupt officials or take shortcuts. This integrity had cost him friends, allies, and even his wife, who had left him 2 years earlier, unable to live with the constant danger and his unwavering moral code. The telegram in his pocket had been brief and urgent. Blackjack Morrison was holed up in Deadwood Creek, planning one final score before disappearing into Mexico. The local sheriff had requested immediate assistance, claiming his small force couldn't handle such a dangerous criminal. But as Harrison rode down the main street, something felt wrong. The town was too quiet, too organized for a place supposedly terrorized by outlaws. The buildings, while weathered, showed signs of recent prosperity. New paint gleamed on several storefronts, and well-dressed men in expensive suits moved purposefully between establishments. Harrison's first stop was the sheriff's office, where he expected to meet Sheriff Tom Bradley and coordinate the capture of Morrison. Instead, he found the office empty, except for a nervous young deputy named Billy Stevens. The deputy's hands shook as he poured coffee, spilling half of it on the floor. When Harrison asked about Sheriff Bradley, Billy's eyes darted around the room like a trapped animal. The deputy explained that Bradley had ridden out that morning to scout Morrison's hideout in the hills outside town. He suggested Harrison wait until the sheriff returned, but something in the young man's manner set off alarm bells in the marshal's mind. Billy kept glancing toward the window as if watching for someone. And his story about the sheriff's whereabouts changed slightly each time he told it. Deciding to investigate on his own, Harrison walked through Deadwood Creek, observing details that didn't add up. The saloons were full of well-armed men who weren't typical cowboys or miners. These men carried expensive weapons and wore clothes that suggested regular pay. They watched Harrison with calculating eyes, whispering among themselves as he passed. At the general store, the owner seemed reluctant to talk, quickly changing the subject whenever Harrison asked about recent events in town. The most telling discovery came at the bank. Harrison noticed that despite reports of Morrison's criminal activities in the area, the bank remained open and apparently unguarded. When he spoke with the bank president, a nervous man named Cornelius Wheaton, the conversation revealed troubling inconsistencies. Wheaton claimed Morrison had robbed 3 banks in neighboring towns, but seemed oddly unconcerned about the safety of his own establishment. When pressed for details about the robberies, Wheaton's descriptions were vague and second-hand. As evening approached, Harrison realized he was completely alone in a town that might be harboring the very criminals he was supposed to arrest. The other law enforcement officers who should have been helping him were mysteriously absent or unavailable. Sheriff Bradley hadn't returned, and no one could explain where the rest of his deputies had gone. The federal agents who were supposed to meet Harrison never appeared, and the telegraph lines to the outside world had been conveniently cut due to storm damage. Harrison's suspicions crystallized when he overheard a conversation between 2 of the well-dressed men outside his hotel. They spoke in low voices about the marshal and keeping him busy until tomorrow night. One mentioned that the boss wants this handled quietly and that too many questions were being asked in the capital. The pieces began forming a picture that made Harrison's blood run cold. That night, as he sat in his hotel room cleaning his weapons and planning his next move, Harrison faced the terrible realization that he might have walked into a trap. The outlaw he was chasing might be working with local officials, or worse, the entire situation might be a carefully orchestrated deception. He was one man against an entire town, with no backup, no support, and no way to communicate with the outside world. The marshal's military training kicked in as he analyzed his situation. Every instinct told him to leave town immediately and return with reinforcements. But his sense of duty and justice wouldn't allow him to abandon his mission. Somewhere in this web of corruption and lies, innocent people were being hurt, and justice was being perverted. If he rode away now, the truth might never come to light. As Harrison prepared for what might be his final night alive, he began documenting everything he had observed in a detailed letter. He hid copies in different locations around his room, hoping that if something happened to him, someone would eventually uncover the evidence. The letter detailed his suspicions about the town's officials, the mysterious absence of other law enforcement, and the strange behavior of the townspeople. Outside his window, Harrison could see men taking positions around the hotel. They tried to be subtle, but their movements were too coordinated to be coincidental. He counted at least 6 armed men in the shadows, all watching his building. The trap was closing, and tomorrow would bring a confrontation that would either expose the truth or end his life. Harrison checked his guns one final time and said a quiet prayer. He had faced impossible odds before, but never while being completely cut off from help. Tomorrow, he would have to rely on his wits, his courage, and his unwavering commitment to justice. The corrupt forces controlling Deadwood Creek had made one critical mistake. They had underestimated the determination of a lawman who would rather die than compromise his principles. The stage was set for a confrontation that would shake the very foundations of law and order in the territory, and Marshal Jake Harrison was the only man standing between justice and a conspiracy that reached far beyond the dusty streets of Deadwood Creek. Dawn broke over Deadwood Creek with an ominous orange glow that painted the sky like dried blood. Marshal Harrison had barely slept, spending the night watching the shadows move around his hotel and planning his survival strategy. He knew that whatever was coming would happen today, and he was determined to be ready for it. The first surprise came at breakfast. Sheriff Bradley finally appeared, walking into the hotel dining room with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Bradley was a large man with graying hair and the soft look of someone who had grown comfortable with corruption. He apologized for his absence, claiming he had been tracking Morrison's gang in the hills and had important news to share. Bradley's story was elaborate but full of holes. He claimed Morrison was planning to rob the territorial government's payroll wagon that was due to pass through town that afternoon. The sheriff suggested they set up an ambush at the town's edge, where the wagon would be most vulnerable. As Bradley outlined the plan, Harrison noticed several things that confirmed his worst fears. The timing was too convenient. A payroll wagon worth enough to attract Morrison's attention just happened to be passing through on the day Harrison arrived. The planned ambush location would isolate Harrison from the town and any potential witnesses. Most tellingly, Bradley seemed to know far too much about Morrison's plans, as if the information had been carefully prepared rather than discovered through investigation. Harrison played along, agreeing to the sheriff's plan while secretly preparing for betrayal. He spent the morning positioning his own contingencies around town. Using his experience from years of dangerous assignments, he identified escape routes, potential allies among the townspeople, and places where he could make a stand if necessary. The young deputy, Billy Stevens, seemed genuinely nervous rather than hostile. So Harrison decided to test whether the boy might be an unwitting pawn rather than a willing conspirator. The test came when Harrison asked Billy to help him check the telegraph lines. As they rode to the edge of town, Harrison carefully questioned the deputy about recent events. Billy's answers revealed a pattern of strange occurrences that the young man had noticed but hadn't understood. New men had been arriving in town for weeks, all claiming to be cowboys or miners, but carrying themselves like professional gunfighters. Money had been flowing freely, with several businesses suddenly prospering after years of struggling. Most importantly, Billy revealed that Sheriff Bradley had been receiving regular visits from a well-dressed stranger who arrived on the train from the territorial capital. These meetings always took place in private, and afterward, Bradley would issue new orders or change established procedures. The deputy's innocent observations painted a picture of corruption that went far beyond simple criminal collaboration. As they returned to town, Harrison made a decision that would define the rest of his life. Instead of riding into Bradley's carefully planned trap, he would force a confrontation in the town itself, where there would be witnesses and where the truth might have a chance to survive, even if he didn't. The afternoon brought the moment of truth. The supposed payroll wagon appeared on schedule, but Harrison's experienced eye immediately spotted the deception. The wagon was too heavily guarded for a routine transport, and the guards moved with military precision that suggested special training. This wasn't a payroll delivery. It was the final piece of whatever conspiracy had brought him to Deadwood Creek. When Sheriff Bradley signaled for them to move to their positions, Harrison made his stand. Instead of following the plan, he stepped into the middle of the main street and called Bradley out in front of the entire town. His voice carried clearly in the afternoon air as he accused the sheriff of corruption and demanded answers about Morrison's real whereabouts. The confrontation that followed revealed the true scope of the conspiracy. Bradley, caught off guard by Harrison's directness, made the mistake of trying to justify his actions. In his anger and surprise, he revealed that Morrison wasn't just an outlaw being protected. He was a tool being used by powerful men in the territorial government to eliminate threats and steal from honest citizens. The scheme was more elaborate than Harrison had imagined. Morrison and his gang would rob banks and steal payrolls, but only from institutions and people who opposed certain political interests. The stolen money would be split between Morrison's men and corrupt officials, while the robberies served the dual purpose of eliminating political enemies and funding illegal operations. Deadwood Creek served as a safe haven where Morrison could hide between jobs, protected by bought and paid-for law enforcement. Harrison's investigation had threatened to expose the entire network, so he had been lured to Deadwood Creek to be eliminated. The plan was to have Morrison kill him during the supposed ambush, making it appear that the marshal died heroically in the line of duty while pursuing dangerous criminals. As Bradley revealed these details in his fury, the townspeople who had gathered to watch the confrontation began to understand the truth about their town's recent prosperity. The money flowing into Deadwood Creek was stolen from their neighbors and fellow citizens. Their sheriff was not protecting them, but using them as cover for criminal operations. The revelation sparked a transformation in the crowd. People who had been afraid to speak out suddenly found their courage. Billy Stevens, understanding for the first time what he had been part of, stepped forward to stand with Harrison. Several townspeople who had been intimidated into silence began sharing their own observations about suspicious activities. But the conspiracy's architects weren't finished. The well-dressed men Harrison had noticed earlier revealed themselves as professional gunfighters hired to ensure the plan's success. They moved to surround Harrison and Bradley, intending to eliminate both men and any witnesses who had heard too much. The gunfight that erupted in the main street of Deadwood Creek would be remembered for generations. Harrison, outnumbered but fighting for justice, found himself joined by unexpected allies. Billy Stevens proved surprisingly capable with a rifle, and several townspeople who had military experience stepped forward to help. The battle raged through the dusty streets, with bullets flying and horses screaming as they fled the chaos. During the fight, Harrison managed to capture one of the hired gunfighters alive. Under pressure and facing certain death, the man revealed the names of the territorial officials who had orchestrated the entire scheme. The conspiracy reached into the highest levels of government, involving judges, politicians, and businessmen who had been using Morrison's gang as their private army. As the smoke cleared, Harrison found himself standing over Sheriff Bradley's body, holding evidence that would shake the territorial government to its core. But he also realized that his victory in Deadwood Creek was only the beginning. The conspiracy was vast and well-connected, and the men behind it would not give up easily. The marshal faced a new challenge that was even more daunting than the gunfight he had just survived. He had to find a way to expose powerful, corrupt officials who had the resources to hunt him down and eliminate him before he could present his evidence to honest authorities. The hangman he had faced in Deadwood Creek was just one tentacle of a much larger and more dangerous beast. The aftermath of the gunfight in Deadwood Creek left Marshal Harrison with more than just victory. He held in his hands evidence that would unravel one of the most extensive corruption schemes in territorial history. The captured gunfighter's confession had revealed names, dates, and details of a conspiracy that reached into the very heart of the territorial government. But as Harrison studied the evidence more carefully, he uncovered a cruel secret that made the entire scheme even more horrifying than he had initially realized. The true scope of the conspiracy became clear when Harrison examined the documents found in Sheriff Bradley's office and the hotel rooms of the hired gunfighters. These papers revealed that the Morrison gang's activities were just one part of a massive operation designed to steal not only money, but entire territories from their rightful owners. The scheme targeted Native American tribes, Mexican landholders, and small homesteaders who lacked the political connections to fight back effectively. The cruel secret at the core of the operation was a systematic program of land theft disguised as law enforcement. Corrupt territorial officials would identify valuable land holdings, then dispatch Morrison's gang to terrorize the owners into fleeing. The outlaws would commit carefully planned crimes that made the areas appear lawless and dangerous, driving down property values and forcing desperate people to sell their land for a fraction of its worth. Once the land was abandoned or sold cheaply, the same officials who had orchestrated the terror campaign would swoop in to purchase the property through front companies and dummy corporations. They would then resell the land to railroad companies, mining interests, and cattle barons for enormous profits. The entire scheme was a deliberate program of economic warfare against the territory's most vulnerable residents. Harrison discovered that dozens of families had been driven from their homes through this system. Native American tribes had lost ancestral lands. Mexican families had been forced to abandon ranches their families had owned for generations, and immigrant homesteaders had fled in terror, believing they were simply unlucky enough to settle in areas plagued by random criminal activity. The documentation revealed that the scheme had been operating for more than 5 years, stealing millions of dollars in land value and displacing hundreds of families. The profits were shared among a network of corrupt judges, territorial legislators, land office officials, and business leaders who used their positions to make the thefts appear legal and legitimate. Even more disturbing was the discovery that Marshal Harrison himself had been an unwitting participant in the scheme's earlier phases. Several outlaws he had tracked and captured in previous assignments had been deliberately sacrificed to maintain the appearance of active law enforcement. These men had been abandoned by their handlers when they became liabilities, allowed to be caught to preserve the larger operation. The realization that he had been manipulated made Harrison's determination to expose the truth even stronger. But he also understood that the evidence he possessed made him one of the most wanted men in the territory. The conspiracy's leaders would spare no expense to eliminate him and recover the documents that could destroy them all. Harrison's first challenge was getting the evidence to honest authorities who could act on it. The corruption reached so deep into the territorial government that he couldn't trust normal law enforcement channels. After careful consideration, he decided to bypass territorial authorities entirely and take his evidence directly to federal officials in Washington who had the power to investigate territorial corruption. The journey to reach federal authorities became a harrowing chase across the frontier. The conspiracy's leaders quickly realized that Harrison had escaped with damaging evidence, and they mobilized every resource available to stop him. Bounty hunters, corrupt lawmen, and hired gunfighters pursued him across 3 territories, forcing him to travel mostly at night and avoid all major towns and settlements. During his flight, Harrison was joined by some of the victims of the land theft scheme who had learned of his mission. These included a group of displaced Mexican ranchers, a band of Cherokee who had lost their traditional hunting grounds, and several families of homesteaders who had been driven from their claims. Together, they formed an unlikely alliance united by their desire for justice and their determination to see the corrupt officials face punishment for their crimes. The group's diverse skills proved invaluable during their dangerous journey. The Cherokee members knew hidden trails that allowed them to avoid pursuit, while the Mexican ranchers contributed their knowledge of desert survival and their contacts among other displaced communities. The homesteaders provided information about which towns and officials could be trusted and which were part of the corrupt network. As they traveled toward the federal authorities, Harrison's group uncovered even more evidence of the scheme's scope. They found entire communities that had been systematically destroyed, their residents scattered, and their land absorbed into the conspiracy's holdings. The pattern was always the same. Mysterious outlaw activity would terrorize an area, legitimate residents would flee or sell their property cheaply, and then well-connected buyers would acquire the land for development by major corporations. The cruel irony of the scheme became apparent when Harrison realized that many of the same politicians and business leaders who publicly advocated for law and order were secretly profiting from the chaos they created. They gave speeches about protecting citizens from criminal activity while privately directing that same criminal activity for their own benefit. The final confrontation came not in a dusty street, but in the marble halls of the territorial Capitol building itself. Harrison and his allies managed to reach federal investigators, but the corrupt officials made one last desperate attempt to silence them before the truth could be revealed. The battle that followed played out in courtrooms and legislative chambers rather than with guns and horses, but it was no less intense or dangerous. The exposure of the conspiracy sent shockwaves through the territorial government and beyond. Dozens of officials were arrested, tried, and convicted for their roles in the land theft scheme. Black Jack Morrison, who had been captured during the investigation, provided detailed testimony about the crimes he had committed on behalf of corrupt politicians in exchange for a reduced sentence. The vindication came at a heavy personal cost for Harrison. His uncompromising pursuit of justice had cost him his career, his marriage, and nearly his life. But as he watched families return to their stolen land and saw new, honest officials take office, he found satisfaction in knowing that his sacrifice had served a greater purpose. The scheme's exposure also led to broader reforms in territorial governance and land administration. New laws were passed to prevent similar conspiracies, and federal oversight of territorial affairs was increased to ensure that such widespread corruption could not take root again. Years later, as Harrison reflected on his experience in Deadwood Creek and its aftermath, he understood that he had uncovered something more significant than simple criminal activity. The conspiracy had represented a systematic assault on the principles of justice and law that made civilized society possible. By exposing the cruel secret at its core, he had helped preserve those principles for future generations. The true measure of Harrison's victory was not in the gunfight he survived or the criminals he captured, but in the families who were able to rebuild their lives and the communities that were restored to their rightful owners. His courage in facing the Hangman without backup had ultimately saved hundreds of innocent people from a scheme designed to rob them of everything they had worked to build. The story of Marshal Jake Harrison and the Deadwood Creek Conspiracy became a legend that inspired other lawmen to maintain their integrity even when facing impossible odds. It served as a reminder that sometimes one person's unwavering commitment to justice could triumph over even the most powerful and well-organized forces of corruption.